Imagine a city without land, born out of mud and marshes, that rose to become a superpower of the seas. A place bold enough to steal the body of a saint, to build its symbol, daring enough to betray the Crusaders, to seize the treasures of Constantinople, and even strange enough to hold a ritual where its leader literally married the ocean to claim eternal dominion. That's Venice, a 1,000-year empire, brilliant, wealthy, creative, and yet it collapsed in just one single day. Hey guys, welcome back. If you love dramatic history full of schemes, betrayals, power struggles, and sheer extravagance, then this story is definitely for you. Don't forget to like, drop a comment, and share this video so more people can discover these hidden stories from history. Alright, let's dive in and explore the journey of Venice, from swamp to splendor, from merchants to masters, from the peak of global power to sudden downfall, and how this city still lives on today as an immortal symbol of human ambition, beauty, and survival. Imagine a city that by every law of logic should never have been born, let alone survived for 1,000 years. A city without land to farm, without mines to dig, without forests to cut, without even the mountains that gave stone to most medieval towns. Its foundation was not solid rock, but shifting mud and restless water. Its streets were not of cobblestone, but of canals. Its walls were not made for armies, but for tides. And yet this city rose where no one expected it, a shimmering impossibility upon a windswept lagoon. To outsiders it seemed a miracle or a folly, perhaps both at once. But to those who built it, it was neither miracle nor madness. It was necessity, survival transformed into greatness. The lagoon itself looked at first like a punishment, a vast stretch of brackish water, dotted with narrow mudflats and tiny islands, no larger than a village square. The wind scoured it with salt, the tides gnawed at its fragile edges, and the sun beat down mercilessly in summer. To step on those islands was to feel the ground tremble, soft and uncertain. Horses could not march here, nor could great armies settle. It was a maze of shallow channels where an intruder might run aground in an instant. It was inhospitable, but that was precisely its virtue. For those who fled from fire and steel, this wasteland was sanctuary. From the beginning, the people who came to this watery exile carried with them nothing but desperation. They were farmers turned refugees, fishermen who had lost their homes, artisans who carried their craft in their hands but no land to practice it on. To survive, they looked at the sea not as an enemy but as a partner. They learned to salt its harvest, to weave nets that could feed them, to gather the brine that left behind the one mineral. The lagoon would yield salt white and crystalline, a currency more reliable than coin. Slowly, painfully, they began to trade that salt and fish with the towns still standing on the mainland. Out of exchange was born a kind of fragile prosperity, the seed of something larger than survival. Yet the greater miracle was not simply that they endured, but that they dared to build. To stand in the lagoon today is to see towers of marble domes of gold bridges arched in stone. But to create such wonders on a foundation of mud seemed impossible. The solution they devised was unlike anything seen elsewhere. They drove millions of wooden piles deep into the marsh, so many that it is said the forest of oak and alder from distant lands was swallowed whole beneath the water. Each pile was forced downward until it struck the hidden clay layer far below. Bound together, these piles became an invisible forest, upside-down roots reaching into the earth to carry the weight of cathedrals. On these they laid platforms of timber, and on timber they placed stone, and on stone they raised their palaces and basilicas. A city born not upon land but upon the will of its builders. This strange foundation shaped more than architecture, it shaped identity. In Venice the road was a canal, and the cart was a gondola. Children learned balance on water as soon as they could walk. Fishermen became sailors, sailors became merchants, merchants became rulers. The very act of living here demanded resourcefulness. To thrive meant to navigate shifting currents both of tide and of politics. Those who could not adapt vanished into obscurity, but those who did became masters of improvisation. The lagoon was their fortress, but it was also their school, teaching them discipline, patience, and above all, pragmatism. For centuries, outsiders dismissed the lagoon as a curiosity, a fragile community destined to sink, and yet the city rose higher and stronger with every generation. Each palace reflected not just wealth, but defiance of nature itself. Each ship that left its docks carried not only cargo, but proof that this impossible place had bent the sea to its will. Venice became more than a city. It became an idea that from the most hostile and unlikely ground human ingenuity could build something eternal. The people who made this city never forgot that it began with flight with terror, with the fear of annihilation. But in transforming mud into marble, they proved something greater than survival. They proved that the impossible could be made permanent, and that beauty itself could be carved from desperation. That is why Venice, shimmering on its waters, has endured not merely as a place on a map, but as a symbol in the imagination of the world, a reminder that even the most fragile beginnings can give rise to a power without rival. In the 5th century, after Christ, the world that had seemed eternal was crumbling. The Western Roman Empire, with its legions, its laws, its aqueducts and roads, was unravelling thread by thread. For centuries, it had stood as the guarantor of order in northern Italy, but now that shield was fractured. Where once there had been prosperity, there were only smoking ruins. Cities that had known centuries of peace trembled at the sound of hooves thundering from the east. The most terrifying of these invaders were the Huns. They were riders from the steppe horsemen who moved like a storm across the horizon. Their leader, Attila, was called the Scourge of God, and to those who faced him, it seemed no less than divine wrath. He did not conquer slowly with treaties and sieges. He descended, suddenly burned and pillaged, and vanished before an army could respond. To Roman citizens of northern Italy, he was an unstoppable nightmare, and his coming meant flight or death. As their towns fell one by one, the people of this fertile land had no choice but to flee. Families abandoned ancestral farms, carrying what they could on carts, clutching icons of saints or scraps of jewellery that might be traded for bread. Behind them, the smoke of their burning homes darkened the sky. Some sought shelter in walled cities further inland, but many realised that no walls could long withstand the fury of steppe cavalry. They needed a refuge beyond the reach of horses, beyond the reach of war itself. It was then that their eyes turned to the lagoon, that desolate maze of salt water and mud, which for centuries had been little more than a place for fishermen and salt workers. To many it looked like exile, a wilderness of brine and mosquitoes. But to those desperate for safety it was salvation. No Hun cavalry could ride across shifting sands and hidden channels. The shallow, unpredictable waters were a natural fortress. To live there would be hardship. To die, there would be less likely than to die on land. And so the people of the Veneti began their exodus into the waters. They loaded their families into boats, piled what tools they had onto rafts, and rowed out into the mist. Imagine the scene: a caravan, not of wagons, but of small vessels, mothers clutching children, fathers scanning the shore for any sign of pursuit. Every splash of an oar was both relief and dread relief, because it meant distance from the invaders' dread, because the future was unknown. When they reached the islands of the lagoon, they found not a paradise but a wasteland. The ground was soft and unstable, salt crusted the earth, and the air smelled of decay. But still they began to build. At first they raised crude huts of reeds and wood. They fished the shallows and harvested salt. They endured hunger and sickness, the sting of insects, and the endless damp. Yet in that bleak setting, something extraordinary began. Those first Venetians were shaped not by choice, but by necessity. They had lost everything, yet, in the act of survival, they created something new. They became a people not tied to land but to water, not rooted in soil but in the tides. Where others saw only mud and salt, they saw safety. From that safety, they would create strength. From that strength, they would craft a city unlike any other. The lagoon was harsh, but it was also impenetrable. While kingdoms rose and fell on the mainland, while warlords carved their names into history with fire and blood, these refugees began to weave together a fragile society upon the waters. They traded fish for grain, salt for iron, timber for cloth. Slowly the huts became houses, the villages became towns. The impossible thought began to take root that this refuge might not only preserve them but define them. They did not know it yet, but their exile had given birth to destiny. From the ashes of the Roman world, in the most unlikely of places, a city would rise that would one day command seas, humble empires, and dazzle the imagination of all who saw it. Venice began as fear fleeing fire. It would become power born upon the water. The question that haunted the first Venetians was simple yet immense. How do you build permanence upon impermanence? They were no longer simply refugees. Their huts of reeds and wood had multiplied. Their families had grown. Their trade across the lagoon with the mainland was steady, if precarious. And yet they knew that what they had raised so far was fragile, swept away by tide and storm as easily as by fire and sword. If they were to endure, they needed stone. They needed a city that could rise above the water with the dignity and strength of Rome itself. But how does one place marble and brick upon mud that shifts beneath every step? The answer, when it came, was less invention than revelation, a kind of radical patience. They would not conquer the lagoon by filling it or fleeing it. They would submit to it using its weakness as their strength. The method they created was astonishing in its simplicity and genius. They cut vast quantities of timber from distant forests and floated them down rivers to the lagoon. Then they drove those logs into the marsh one by one, like spears piercing soft earth. They hammered until each pile struck not water or mud, but the hidden layer of compact clay far below. The work was endless, monotonous, and grueling, but slowly the lagoon began to change. Beneath the surface, a forest grew upside down, trunks buried in the deep, unseen but unyielding. Upon this forest they laid great platforms of oak and larch beams, crossing beams until the weight of stone could rest upon them. Then the masons brought their marble, their brick, their tiles, and they built upwards. What had once been shifting mud became a foundation strong enough for palaces and basilicas. The miracle of Venice was not that it floated, but that it stood an entire city balanced upon a hidden architecture of wood and willpower. Every building was a gamble. To raise a church meant not only prayer but engineering. To build a palace meant not only wealth, but faith that the piles beneath would hold for centuries. Yet hold they did. Driven deep into oxygenless mud, those timbers petrified with time becoming harder than stone. What was born from necessity became endurance, and endurance became beauty. This act of defiance against nature shaped the character of the Venetians themselves. Other cities could expand by marching outward, spreading across fertile valleys or rolling plains. Venice could not. Its borders were the water. To grow meant to build taller, stronger, more ingeniously. Each canal became a street, each bridge a lifeline, each square a stage where survival played out as ritual. In bending their lives to the lagoon, they made themselves into a people unlike any other pragmatic, yet daring, cautious, yet bold artisans and merchants who carried both hammer and compass in their souls. The sight of this city rising from the water astonished all who approached. Sailors entering the lagoon would see towers gleaming above the marshes, domes catching the sun, churches seeming to float upon the tide. To them, Venice appeared as if summoned from myth, a vision of marble upon the sea. Yet every stone of it was a victory carved from mud. Every arch and colonnade was a refusal to accept that survival alone was enough. For the Venetians, building was never only construction, it was declaration. It told the world that what began as exile was now permanence, that a people who had once fled in fear had forged a home stronger than any fortress. Their streets of water were no weakness. They were lifelines to a wider world. Their foundations of wood were not fragile. They were roots sunk deep into the hidden heart of the earth. Thus the lagoon, once seen as barren and unworthy, became the womb of a civilization. From those first piles driven into the mud, the Republic would rise. Its destiny was no longer to hide but to rule, and in the stones that stood above the waves, the Venetians had already whispered the truth of what was to come, that theirs was a city born not merely to endure, but to astonish. As the settlements of the lagoon grew, from fragile clusters of huts into a thriving city, another question arose, one that was as dangerous as it was inevitable: who would rule this new society? For generations, the Venetians had lived with the memory of tyrants. They remembered the warlords of the mainland, men who had burned and plundered in the name of power. They remembered fleeing from kings and generals whose ambition had crushed entire provinces. They had escaped into the lagoon to free themselves from the cruelty of absolute rulers. Now, as their wealth increased and their influence spread, they faced the peril of repeating the very system they had fled. The lagoon had given them safety from armies, but it offered no protection from themselves. Without order, their prosperity would dissolve into chaos. Without leadership, their growing city would collapse into factionalism, yet the spectre of monarchy haunted them. The Venetians wanted stability without tyranny, authority without despotism. Out of this dilemma, they forged something that was at once fragile and enduring, cautious and ingenious, a political system that balanced ambition with mistrust. In the 8th century, they created the office of the Doge. The word came from the Latin dux, meaning leader, but unlike a king, the Doge was not to be a sovereign. He was chosen by election, not birthright, selected for life by the city's most powerful families. He was crowned in ceremony, but his crown was not a symbol of unchecked command. From the beginning, his authority was bound by oaths and overseen by councils. To the people, the Doge was a living emblem of Venice's continuity, the guardian of its traditions and the figurehead of its glory. Yet he was also a prisoner of the system that created him. Every letter he received was read by state officials before he saw it. He could not leave the city without permission. His sons were forbidden from holding office while he lived, so that no dynasty might rise in his shadow. Even his will upon death was inspected for signs of hidden power. In a world where kings reigned as if anointed by heaven, the Venetians treated their leader as a man bound hand and foot by suspicion. The true power of the Republic lay with its merchant aristocracy, the families whose fortunes rose from trade. Their wealth came not from conquest of land, but from mastery of the sea. They feared nothing more than a single man who might use the state for personal glory. For them, commerce thrived only in stability, and stability required that no one hand hold absolute control. Thus the government evolved into an elaborate clockwork of councils, each checking the other, each designed to prevent any gear from spinning too fast. At the heart of this system was the Great Council, a vast assembly of the noble families. From it were drawn the smaller councils that managed every detail of the state. The Doge was elected by a labyrinth of ballots and counter-ballots, a process so complex it seemed designed less to choose the best man than to prevent corruption itself. It was a republic, but not a democracy. Power did not flow from the people, but from the merchants guarded like treasure in their palaces along the canals. To protect themselves from betrayal, they even created the Council of Ten, a shadowy body tasked with rooting out treason. Its agents listened in taverns, its spies prowled alleys, and its infamous lions' mouths invited anonymous accusations, slipped into stone. Fear kept the city vigilant. Suspicion kept it secure. The Republic was a paradox, a state founded on mistrust, yet made stable by that very mistrust. Elsewhere in Europe, kingdoms tore themselves apart. With civil wars, dynasties rose and fell, and thrones passed from father to son in bloody succession. Venice, by contrast, endured. Its system was not swift, not generous, and not free by modern measure, but it was strong. It gave the city a foundation as firm as the wooden piles driven into the mud centuries before. By denying themselves the comfort of kingship, the Venetians secured for themselves the stability of 1,000 years. And so the lagoon, once a refuge from tyranny, became the stage for a new kind of government. In its chambers of marble, men argued, voted, and schemed, but no single man reigned supreme. Venice had no monarch, only a doge who was both ruler and prisoner, a prince bound by chains of law. It was a republic of merchants, a state of suspicion, and yet against all odds it worked. For the first centuries of its existence, Venice lived beneath the shadow of another empire. Though the lagoon seemed distant and self-contained, the city was officially part of the Byzantine world, an outpost tethered to the brilliance of Constantinople. From the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire radiated wealth, learning, and power. Its mosaics glimmered with gold, its emperors ruled in splendor, and its armies guarded the frontiers of Christendom. Venice, in theory, was but a duchy, a semi-autonomous province at the edge of that empire. Yet in practice, it was something more complicated, both servant and opportunist, loyal subject and shrewd manipulator. Geographically, the Venetians lived in the west, but culturally, they leaned eastward. Byzantine craftsmen taught them to cover their basilicas with glittering mosaics. Byzantine merchants granted them access to markets no one else could touch. Byzantine emperors relied on their fleets to defend against Normans and Arabs. The bond was strong, but it was never equal. Venice needed Byzantium, but Byzantium also needed Venice. And in that dependence, the merchants of the lagoon found their leverage. The turning point came in the year 1082. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, desperate for naval aid against invaders, offered Venice an extraordinary gift in return for its fleet. He issued a golden bull, a decree that gave Venetian merchants the right to trade throughout the empire, virtually free of tax. At a stroke, Venice became not merely a participant in Mediterranean commerce, but its master. While Genoa and Pisa struggled under tariffs and duties, Venetian ships sailed into Constantinople itself with privileged access. They unloaded wool from Flanders, iron from Germany, glass from Murano, and in return filled their holds with silk, spices, and jewels. The effect was explosive. The city's markets on the Rialto became flooded with goods, its warehouses groaned with cargo, its coin flowed like a river. In a world where wealth was measured in peppercorns, Venice had gained a monopoly, backed not by conquest, but by decree. It was an empire of parchment, but no less powerful for that. Yet this prosperity came with consequences. The privileges granted to Venetian merchants deprived Byzantium of much of its own revenue. Taxes that once enriched the imperial treasury now flowed into Venetian coffers, and as their fortunes rose, so too did resentment. In Constantinople, locals watched as Venetian traders strutted through the streets, arrogant in their wealth, secure in their protections. Riots erupted, blood was spilled, and suspicion hardened into hatred. The servant was becoming richer than the master. By the 12th century, the old alliance had soured. Byzantium saw Venice not as an ally, but as a parasite feeding upon its veins. Venice, for its part, no longer viewed the empire as protector, but as rival. The golden mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica still gleamed in Byzantine style, but the political bond had fractured beyond repair. The balance of power had shifted, and Venice knew it. This tension set the stage for events that would shock the medieval world. For the Venetians had learned a dangerous lesson. Loyalty was a tool, and profit was worth more than oaths. Their city was no longer a dependent duchy, but a rising power with ambitions of its own. The lagoon that once offered only safety was now the harbour of a fleet that could make or unmake empires. And soon Venice would turn that fleet against the very power that had once raised it. Venice was rising, but it lacked something that no wealth or treaty could provide. For a republic to be more than a city of merchants, it needed a soul, a symbol, a patron whose presence could bind its people together and proclaim to the world its independence. At that time, Venice's spiritual heart still lay in Constantinople, for its patron saint, and was a minor figure of the Byzantine Church. To the Venetians, this was a humiliation, a reminder that they were once subjects. If they were to be free in truth, as well as in practice, they needed a relic worthy of empire. They needed a saint of their own, one whose name could rival Rome's apostles and Constantinople's martyrs. And so their eyes turned southward across the Mediterranean to Alexandria in Egypt. There, in a quiet shrine, guarded by monks, rested the body of none other than Street, Mark the Evangelist, the man whose gospel had given voice to the lion. For Venice this was not just a relic, it was destiny. Street. Mark had once preached in the lagoons according to legend, and his symbol, the winged lion, was already tied to the city. To claim his remains would be to claim divine legitimacy itself. The task was impossible, sacrilegious, and dangerous. Alexandria was under Muslim rule, and the body of the saint was guarded not only by piety, but by political power. Yet two Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, dared what others would not. They sailed their ship to Egypt under the guise of commerce, but their true mission was theft, sanctified by faith. Through persuasion, bribes, and cunning, they convinced the guardians of the shrine to part with the saint's remains. But the greatest challenge lay not in removing the body, but in smuggling it past the customs officials of Alexandria's port. To be caught would mean not only death for them, but disgrace for their city. It was here that Venetian pragmatism shone. They placed the saint's body inside a large basket, then covered it with slabs of pork and cabbage leaves. When the Muslim inspectors who considered pork unclean came to search the cargo, they recoiled in disgust and waved the shipment through without further examination. In that moment, a relic that had rested in Egypt for centuries was carried aboard a Venetian ship. The sails were raised, the oars dipped into the sea, and the vessel slipped out of the harbour with a prize greater than gold or jewels. The theft was an act of audacity so great that it bordered on legend, and yet it was true. The Venetians had stolen a saint. When the ship reached the lagoon, word spread like fire. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and the entire city erupted in celebration. The arrival of Street Mark's body was not just the coming of a relic, it was the birth of a new identity. Venice was no longer a cultural satellite of Byzantium. It was a chosen city blessed with an evangelist as its guardian. Street. Mark had come home, and with him came a symbol that would define Venice forever, the lion, with wings holding a book, proclaiming peace or unsheathing claws as needed. From that day, the Lion of Street Mark adorned coins fluttered on banners and stood carved into the gates of conquered cities. The saint's new resting place, the Basilica of San Marco, became the jewel of the Republic, its domes glittering with mosaics that blended Byzantine artistry with Venetian ambition. To steal a saint was to declare independence to sever the last thread tying Venice to subservience. It was a holy theft, a pious crime, a heist that transformed faith into empire. The Venetians told themselves that they had not stolen, but rescued. They claimed they had saved the relic from desecration, cloaking their audacity in the language of devotion. But beneath that veneer lay a truth as pragmatic as the pork and cabbage that had hidden the saint's bones. Venice would stop at nothing to secure its destiny. In that daring act, the city announced to the world that it was no longer merely a republic of merchants, but a republic chosen by heaven. It had a relic, a symbol, and a lion to roar across the seas. From that moment forward, the city of mud and salt water was something more, a sacred empire in the making, whose ambition knew neither fear nor shame. The arrival of St. Mark's body in Venice marked a turning point so profound that it transformed not only the city's faith, but its very identity. The people poured into the streets and canals to witness the procession. They lit torches, rang bells, and filled the lagoon with a chorus of shouts and hymns. What they celebrated was not merely the coming of holy relics, but the rebirth of their community as something greater than a cluster of islands. Venice was now a chosen city, protected by an evangelist, whose authority rivaled even Rome. In that moment of triumph, the Venetians proclaimed a new destiny for themselves. They were no longer the forgotten outpost of Byzantium, nor merely the keepers of salt and fish. They had stolen legitimacy from across the sea and remade themselves as the guardians of St. Mark. This was not just faith. It was branding. The lion of St. Mark, wings outstretched, and a gospel in its paws became the emblem of the Republic. It was stamped on coins, etched into stone, and unfurled upon banners that fluttered over ships and fortresses alike. Wherever Venetians went, their lion followed, announcing both holiness and dominion. To house their new patron, they raised a basilica unlike any the lagoon had seen. San Marco rose from the heart of the city as a mosaic jewel, a shimmering fusion of Byzantine splendor and Venetian ambition. Its domes glittered with golden light, its arches told stories in brilliant glass, its walls breathed with the scent of incense and salt air. It was not only a place of worship, but a proclamation in stone. Venice had arrived, and it would rival Rome and Constantinople, not just in wealth, but in sanctity. The symbolism was carefully woven into every detail. To step inside San Marco was to step into a vision of eternity, where heaven itself seemed to spill across the walls in images of saints and angels. But for the Venetians, the basilica was also the beating heart of politics. Its location beside the Doge's palace made it inseparable from the machinery of the state. Faith and power were fused together, just as the Lion of St. Mark symbolized both gospel and sword. For the people, the possession of the saint's relics created a sense of invincibility. To live under the protection of an evangelist was to believe that their city was destined to endure against enemies and storms alike. To foreign powers, the symbolism was unmistakable. The Republic now possessed a holy relic of such magnitude that it placed Venice among the most sacred centres of Christendom. Pilgrims began to arrive, merchants felt their trade blessed, and rivals watched with envy and unease. Yet behind the grandeur lay the same Venetian pragmatism that had hidden the relic in pork and cabbage. This was not only devotion, it was strategy. By claiming St. Mark, Venice declared spiritual independence from Byzantium, ensuring that its authority no longer flowed from Constantinople. The Republic had given itself a divine protector, but also a political weapon, one that could justify expansion and defend ambition. From that day, every conquest, every treaty, every festival carried the mark of the lion. It was carved above city gates, guarding ports in distant seas. It was engraved into marble columns and painted upon ships' prows as they sailed for war or commerce. It was the constant reminder that Venice was no longer just a republic of merchants, but a republic of destiny. And so the theft of a body became the birth of an empire. The saints' remains, smuggled through fear and cunning, had remade the city. The basilica rose, the lion roared, and Venice began to see itself not as a fragile community balanced on mud, but as a chosen people with a divine protector. The impossible city now had not only foundations of wood and stone, but foundations of faith strong enough to carry it across centuries. At the heart of Venice, behind walls of red brick and towers of stone, stood a place as mysterious as it was formidable. Outsiders whispered about it with awe for what lay hidden. There was no ordinary shipyard. It was the arsenal, the very engine of Venetian power, a fortress of industry centuries ahead of its time. If San Marco was the soul of the Republic, the arsenal was its beating heart. From its gates came not sermons or decrees, but fleets, war galleys, and merchant convoys that projected Venice's will across the seas. Most cities of the Middle Ages built ships slowly, laboriously, one vessel at a time, each crafted as though it were a unique work of art. Venice, by contrast, turned shipbuilding into a science. Within the arsenal's sprawling complex, the Venetians devised a method that would astonish the world: the assembly line. Here, parts were standardized, interchangeable, and produced in workshops dedicated to a single task. One hall might craft oars by the hundreds, another would forge nails and anchors, and another weave ropes so thick it seemed endless. Each worker was a master of his part, and his part alone. The result was speed, precision, and efficiency beyond imagining. Along the arsenal's production canal, a bare hull was floated in at one end. As it moved down the waterway, it stopped at stations where teams of artisans swarmed aboard, fitting benches for rowers, stepping masts, rigging sails, mounting weapons. By the time the ship emerged at the other end, it was no skeleton but a predator, armed and ready for the sea. One visiting dignitary claimed he had seen a galley built and launched in the time it took him to finish his meal. This was not hyperbole. At the height of its power, Venice could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day. No other power in Europe could match such speed. In times of crisis, entire fleets seemed to spring from the lagoon overnight, stunning rivals and striking terror into enemies. The arsenal had made Venice invincible, for it could replace losses faster than any foe could inflict them. But the arsenal was more than a factory. It was a society within a society. The men who worked there, the arsenalotti, were a privileged class, state employees with secure wages, pensions, and even housing for their families. In return, they owed Venice loyalty, not only of skill, but of secrecy. For within those walls lay knowledge that other powers would kill to obtain the secrets of mass production of ship design of cannons forged in Venetian foundries. The arsenal was a fortress, not only of walls but of silence. To see the arsenal in motion was to glimpse the future. The rhythmic pounding of hammers, the groaning of ropes, the shouts of foremen. It was an industrial symphony centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Where others saw chaos, Venice imposed order. Where others relied on luck, Venice relied on planning. It was this discipline that allowed a city built on mud to command oceans. The arsenal was not just a marvel of engineering, it was a statement of identity. Venice was not Rome conquering with legions on land. Venice was not a kingdom of fields and castles. It was a republic of the sea, and its arsenal was the forge of its empire. Each galley launched was a message: we are merchants, but we are also warriors. We are craftsmen, but we are also conquerors. When Venetian fleets paraded through the lagoon, their oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm, the people cheered not only for their sailors, but for the unseen army of labourers who had built the ships. The arsenal gave Venice its weapon, its pride and its shield. It allowed the city to fight wars, guard its trade, and intimidate rivals with a power that seemed limitless. In truth, the arsenal was the Republic itself in miniature, a place where individuals worked not for glory, but for the collective, where secrecy preserved survival, where precision ensured dominance. It was proof that Venice thrived not through size or resources, but through ingenuity. And as long as the arsenal roared with life, the Republic could look upon the horizon and know that no sea was beyond its reach. Venice had built ships faster than any rival, raised basilicas, more splendid than any cathedral of the north, and commanded the sea with fleets that seemed to multiply at will. Yet power is not measured by weapons alone. It is also measured by ritual, by symbols that remind a people who they are and proclaim to the world what they claim. In this too Venice excelled. No ritual embodied its identity more than the ceremony of the Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage of the sea. Each year on Ascension Day, the city gathered in its greatest spectacle. Crowds thronged the quays, nobles in silks and jewels filled their barges, and pilgrims craned their necks from every bridge. At the centre of it all was the Bucintoro, the state galley of the Doge, a vessel so ornate it seemed built for a king of heaven rather than a ruler of men. Its hull glittered with gold leaf, its prow soared into the shape of angels, its decks were lined with crimson draperies. As the Doge stepped aboard in his scarlet robes and corno ducal, the people erupted in cheers, for in him they saw not just a man, but the living embodiment of their republic. The Bucintoro glided out across the lagoon, rowed in perfect rhythm by oarsmen chosen for their strength and stature. Behind it followed a flotilla of smaller boats, a procession of colour and sound that stretched as far as the eye could see. Priests raised their voices in hymns, trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the waters themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of celebration. But at the heart of it all lay a single act, simple yet profound. When the Bucintoro reached the mouth of the lagoon, the Doge took from his hand a golden ring. He held it high so all could see, and then cast it into the sea. As the waters closed over the gleam of gold, he spoke the ancient words, Desponsimus temere in signum veri, perpetuique domini. We wed thee, O sea, as a sign of true and eternal dominion. The crowd roared, not in laughter at the audacity, but in solemn assent. For this was not metaphor. To Venice the sea was not merely a highway of commerce or a battlefield of galleys. It was spouse and sovereign territory alike. Just as a man might bind himself to a wife, so the Republic bound itself to the waves. The lagoon was not an obstacle to overcome, but a partner to embrace. The Adriatic was not a wilderness, but a possession, a dowry, a destiny. Foreign visitors often marvelled at the spectacle. Some mocked it as vanity, others admired it as genius, yet all understood its meaning. Venice was declaring itself mistress of the sea, not by force of arms alone, but by sacred bond. The ritual transformed conquest into covenant politics, into marriage. No storm, no rival, no empire could claim the waters without first challenging the vows spoken from the deck of the Bucintoro. For the Venetians themselves, the ceremony was more than pageantry. It was reassurance. Each year, as the ring sank into the waves, they were reminded that their lives, their wealth, their very existence depended on the water. The sea had given them refuge from barbarians, had carried their merchants to distant ports, had guarded them with tides and shallows. To honour it was not superstition but gratitude. To wed it was not arrogance but necessity. And yet woven into this ritual of devotion was a subtle defiance. By marrying the sea, Venice also proclaimed that no other ruler, neither pope nor emperor, could claim authority over its dominion. The Republic's power was not borrowed from the church, nor granted by crown. It was born of its bond with the water itself, sanctified each year by the Doge's hand. As the Bucintoro turned back toward the city, its oars flashing in the sun, the people on the shore saw not merely a festival, but a prophecy. They believed with a conviction as deep as the lagoon that Venice was eternal because its marriage was eternal. Empires might fall, kings might die, but the sea endured, and with it, the Republic. In that golden ring swallowed each year by the Adriatic lay the essence of Venice: faith and pragmatism, ritual and power, beauty and cunning. The city that had risen from mud, now ruled by marriage, a bride forever wedded to the sea. By the dawn of the 13th century, Venice had grown from a cluster of marshland settlements into a republic whose sails stretched across the Adriatic. Its fleets carried goods from Constantinople to the ports of France. Its merchants grew fat on silk and spices, and its coffers overflowed with gold. But the city hungered for more. Wealth was not enough. To dominate the sea, Venice needed power, and power demanded war. Opportunity came in the form of the Fourth Crusade. Preachers across Europe called for knights to march once more to liberate Jerusalem. Thousands of warriors full of zeal but empty of ships needed transport across the Mediterranean. They turned to Venice, the unrivaled master of the sea. The Republic agreed, but not out of piety. The Venetians saw in the crusade a chance to harness Christian fervour for their own gain. For a staggering fee, they promised to build a fleet large enough to carry the crusading host to the Holy Land. The task fell to the arsenal, and it rose magnificently to the challenge. Galley after galley slid into the water, their hulls gleaming their sails, ready to catch the wind. Yet when the Crusaders arrived, their numbers had dwindled. Fewer men than promised, and fewer coins to pay the Venetians. The Republic had built a fleet for 100,000 warriors, but barely a third had come, and the coffers of Christendom could not pay the bill. Venice faced ruin if it released the fleet without profit. It was then that the figure of Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, stepped into legend. Old and blind, his body bent with age, yet his mind burned sharp as steel. He was nearly 90 years old, but when he mounted the pulpit of San Marco to speak to the people, that his voice carried like a storm. He urged them to take the cross themselves, to join the crusade not as transporters but as warriors. His blindness was no weakness, but a symbol, for though he could not see the world with his eyes, he saw it with ruthless clarity. Dandolo proposed a bold solution. The Crusaders could not pay, but Venice could take payment in action. To the south lay the Dalmatian city of Zara, a Christian port that had defied Venetian control and allied itself with rivals. If the Crusaders could not give gold, let them give conquest. Together they would seize Zara, and the debt would be forgiven. It was a shocking proposal, for Zara was not Muslim but Christian, its people fellow believers. But desperation is a powerful persuader, and the Crusaders, unwilling to abandon their cause, agreed. The fleet of Venice set sail not for Jerusalem, but for a city of their own faith. When the galleys appeared before Zara, their sails blackened the horizon. The Crusaders, filled with shame, yet compelled by necessity, attacked. Venetian banners flew above the walls as the city fell in blood and fire. The Fourth Crusade had not even reached the Holy Land, and already it had been twisted into a tool of Venetian ambition. The scandal shook Christendom. The Pope thundered with outrage, excommunicating the Crusaders and Venetians alike. Yet Dandolo did not flinch. In his blindness, he had seen what others could not, that the crusade was not a holy mission, but a weapon to be wielded. Venice would harness its zeal, its armies, and its ships, and turn them not toward Jerusalem, but toward an even greater prize. For Dandolo's ambition did not stop at Zara. His eyes, though sightless, were fixed on the greatest city of Christendom, the jewel of the East, Constantinople. And soon, under the guidance of a blind old man, the crusade itself would march not against the enemies of Christ, but against Christians, in an act of betrayal so audacious that it would shake the foundations of the medieval world. The fleet that had set out to liberate Jerusalem now found itself anchored in the shadow of the greatest Christian city in the world. Constantinople rose before them like a vision from scripture, walls of stone that seemed to scrape the heavens, domes gilded in gold palaces stretching along the Bosporus like jewels scattered on a velvet shore. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome itself, a place that dazzled travellers and humbled kings. To think that an army sworn to Christ would soon raise its banners against such a city was unthinkable, and yet it was about to happen. The Crusaders had been lured there by promises. A deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, had begged them for aid. "Help me reclaim my father's throne," he pleaded, "and I will reward you with treasure, soldiers, and obedience to the Pope." The offer was irresistible to the Venetians, who saw in it not just repayment of debt, but a chance to bend an empire to their will. Enrico Dandolo, blind but unbowed, guided the decision with the certainty of one who understood that faith was a tool and fortune the true goal. And so the crusade born in piety became a march of betrayal. The ships lined the waters of the Golden Horn, their decks bristling with soldiers. Siege towers were mounted on galleys designed to roll against the mighty walls. The people of Constantinople looked out from their ramparts in disbelief. These were not Turks or Saracens, but fellow Christians carrying the cross on their banners as they prepared to sack the holiest city of Christendom. The assault was fierce and relentless. Venetian marines stormed the sea walls, scaling ladders under a rain of arrows and fire. Crusader knights battered the gates from the landward side, their horses armoured in steel, their lances lowered as if charging into battlefields of old. Above it all, the Venetian fleet pressed forward, galleys ramming and pushing against the very walls of the city. The air was filled with smoke, the cries of the dying, the clash of steel. After days of fighting, Constantinople fell. Its gates were thrown open not to liberators but to looters. What followed was a horror that shocked even hardened soldiers. Churches were stripped of their treasures, chalices melted down for coin relics, scattered like spoils of war. Icons that had been venerated for centuries were smashed, monasteries desecrated, and nuns violated. Horses were stabled in the great church of Hagia Sophia, its marble floors slick with blood where once prayers had echoed. The wealth of the greatest city in Christendom poured into Venetian holds. Gold, jewels, silks, manuscripts, even entire columns and statues were shipped back across the sea. Venice, which had once been the humble refuge of fugitives in a marsh, now carried home the spoils of an empire. The famous bronze horses that today stand above the entrance of San Marco were torn from Constantinople's hippodrome and set as trophies on the Basilica of Venice, a declaration in bronze of triumph and theft. The betrayal reverberated across the Christian world. The Pope, horrified, condemned the sack. Yet the Venetians shrugged. They had not gone to Jerusalem, but they had won an empire of trade routes, colonies, and wealth beyond imagination. Constantinople, crippled and humiliated, would never fully recover. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, already deep, became a chasm, and at the centre of it all stood Venice, richer, more powerful, and more feared than ever before. For the Crusaders, it was shame. For the Byzantines, it was catastrophe. But for Venice, it was victory, cold, calculated, and immense. The blind Doge had steered an army of Christ, not to salvation, but to conquest, and in doing so, he had carved out the foundations of a maritime empire that would stretch across the Mediterranean. The lagoon people had struck the greatest city in Christendom and emerged triumphant. It was an act so audacious, so ruthless, that it defined Venice for centuries to come. No longer just merchants, no longer merely survivors of marshes, they had proven themselves masters of deception, masters of the sea, and masters of empire. The Lion of St. Mark, now stood not only for faith but for dominion carved from betrayal. The sack of Constantinople did more than fill Venetian treasuries with gold and relics. It redrew the very map of the Mediterranean. Out of the ruins of Byzantium, Venice carved for itself an empire, not of land in the traditional sense, but of harbours, islands, and sea lanes. What began as a cluster of mudflats in a lagoon now stretched its shadow across the waters of the east. Venetian soldiers and merchants seized the choicest spoils of the Byzantine world. They occupied Crete, gateway of the eastern Mediterranean. They claimed key ports along the Dalmatian coast, ensuring that the Adriatic was theirs alone. They planted colonies in the Aegean, stringing together islands like pearls on a necklace, each one a station where Venetian ships could dock, repair, and resupply. Every conquest was less about glory than logistics. Venice was a city of merchants, and merchants understood that power flowed not from battlefields, but from control of routes. In these outposts, the Lion of St. Mark appeared, carved into gates and fluttering on banners. The symbol was no longer confined to Venice itself, but spread like a brand across the sea. To step ashore in a Venetian colony was to enter a miniature republic. The same laws, the same coinage, the same suspicion of tyranny. Governors appointed from the lagoon ruled with merchant pragmatism, ensuring that taxes were collected, trade was protected, and loyalty to Venice was absolute. The empire was peculiar, unlike any other in Europe. It had no vast hinterland of farms to feed it, no sweeping plains or forests to supply armies. It was an empire of ports, an archipelago of power. Its lifeblood was the sea, its walls were ships, its wealth was trade. Where kings ruled land, Venice ruled water. It was a republic of tide and current, of sails and oars. This system made Venice rich beyond imagination. Spices from the Orient, silk from China, grain from Egypt, timber from Dalmatia, all flowed through its colonies into the warehouses of the Rialto. The city became the hub of a wheel whose spokes reached across 3 continents. With every transaction, with every voyage, Venice tightened its grip on the Mediterranean. Yet empire brought more than wealth. It brought enemies. Genoa, the rival republic, watched with envy as Venice's colonies multiplied. The Byzantine remnant seethed with resentment at the loss of its islands. Even the Pope, while benefiting from Venetian fleets, mistrusted the city's hunger for dominance. But the Venetians thrived in such a climate. They understood that survival depended not on eliminating rivals, but on outmaneuvering them, playing one against the other, keeping commerce flowing even amid conflict. Inside Venice, the spoils of empire transformed daily life. Palaces grew taller, decorated with columns and statues stripped from Constantinople. Churches glittered with mosaics salvaged from the east. The city itself became a museum of conquest, each stone a reminder of the day when Venetian ships had plundered the Queen of Cities. Wealthy merchants displayed treasures not only as proof of devotion, but as advertisements of power. To walk through Venice was to stroll through a catalogue of empire, where east and west mingled in marble and gold. But empire also changed how Venetians saw themselves. No longer merely survivors of a swamp, they now believed themselves chosen to rule the sea. The marriage to the sea, once a ritual of gratitude, became a proclamation of empire. When the Doge cast his golden ring into the Adriatic, it was not just the lagoon he wed, but the whole sweep of waters, from Crete to Dalmatia, from the Aegean to the Levant. The Adriatic was theirs, and they intended to keep it so. The empire of the sea was fragile, in theory, vulnerable to rebellion, piracy, and shifting tides of politics. But in practice, it proved astonishingly durable. For centuries, Venetian governors held their islands. Venetian fleets patrolled the sea, and Venetian merchants grew wealthy beyond measure. It was a system built not on land, but on waves. and yet it stood as firmly as any kingdom on earth. In the end, Venice had transformed theft into dominion. The sack of Constantinople, brutal as it was, had given birth to a maritime empire unparalleled in its day. From the lagoon to the Levant, the Lion of St. Mark roared, and the waters themselves seemed to echo his cry. Amid the splendour of Venice's empire, one name rose above all others, a name whispered in marketplaces from the Levant to the farthest reaches of Asia, Marco Polo. He was not a doge, not a general, not a priest, but a merchant's son whose journey would carry him farther than any Venetian ship, and whose words would transform how Europe imagined the world. Marco was only 17 when he left the lagoon in the year 1271. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo had already travelled east, venturing into the lands of the Mongols. Now, with their young son and nephew in tow, they set out once more, their eyes fixed not on Constantinople or Alexandria, but on the distant court of the great Khan. Few in Venice could have imagined the scale of the journey ahead. To most Europeans, Asia was a mystery, a place of vague legends and hearsay. For Marco, it would become the stage of his life. The journey carried them across the Mediterranean, through the Levant, over the mountains of Armenia, and into the endless deserts of Persia. They braved bandits, storms and thirst, pushing ever deeper into lands where Latin was unknown, and Venetian coin meant little. Marco, barely more than a boy, absorbed it all. He learned languages, noted customs, studied the strange beasts and plants of distant lands. Where others saw hardship, he saw knowledge. His eyes were wide open, and nothing escaped them. At last, after years of travel, the Polos reached their destination, the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, the most powerful man on earth. His dominion stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of Europe, a realm so vast that it defied imagination. In his capital of Cambaluc, what we know today as Beijing, Marco entered a world unlike anything Venice had ever dreamed. The court glittered with silks and gold, its halls filled with scholars, astrologers, and emissaries from every corner of the world. The Khan himself, seated in majesty, commanded armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, herds that covered the steppes like waves, and treasuries overflowing with the riches of China. To Marco, this was not a barbarian chieftain, but a sovereign whose civilization surpassed anything in Christendom. Kublai Khan, recognizing the young Venetian's keen intelligence, took him into service. For years, Marco travelled on missions across the empire, from the cities of Cathay to the coasts of India, from the palaces of Persia to the jungles of Southeast Asia. He marvelled at paper money, porcelain, gunpowder, and the intricate systems of administration that kept the vast empire running. He recorded the customs of peoples unknown to Europe, described animals like elephants and rhinoceroses, and detailed wonders such as the Grand Canal, greater than any waterway in the West. When Marco finally returned to Venice, after more than 2 decades, he carried not only wealth, but stories that seemed too fantastical to be true. He spoke of cities with walls longer than entire kingdoms, of black stones that burned hotter than wood, coal, and of a civilization where silk was as common as cloth in Europe. Many dismissed his tales as exaggerations, and he earned the nickname Il Milione, as if his stories multiplied facts into millions. Yet for those who listened with open minds, Marco had revealed a world that shattered the narrow horizons of medieval Europe. His account, eventually dictated while imprisoned during a war with Genoa, spread like wildfire. The Travels of Marco Polo became one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages, inspiring generations to dream beyond their borders. For merchants, it hinted at unimaginable wealth. For explorers, it sketched paths yet untravelled. For rulers, it revealed the existence of powers rivaling their own. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus would sail west, carrying a copy convinced that Marco's descriptions could guide him to Asia. For Venice, Marco Polo embodied the Republic's essence, bold, curious, pragmatic, and unafraid to cross oceans or empires in pursuit of opportunity. He was not a conqueror, but his words conquered imaginations. He was not a ruler, but his stories ruled the minds of men who would shape history. Through him, the city of merchants extended its reach, not only across seas but across centuries. In Marco Polo's life, Venice proved once more that it was not a place of limits but of horizons. Born from mud, it had risen to rule the Mediterranean. Through Marco, it now touched the edges of the known world. Wealth poured into Venice from east and west, but no empire thrives without rivals. Across the sea, another republic had risen as hungry and ambitious as Venice itself. Genoa, the proud city of Liguria, stood as mirror and enemy, a people of sailors and merchants who matched the Venetians in cunning and ferocity. For a century and more, the two republics clashed their wars, fought not only with fleets of galleys, but with contracts, treaties, and bribes. They were twin predators circling the same prey, each seeking to dominate the arteries of Mediterranean trade. The rivalry was inevitable. Venice looked eastward to the spices and silks of Asia, carried across the Levant into its warehouses. Genoa looked westward to the trade of Spain and North Africa, but soon both reached for the same markets in Constantinople, the Black Sea, and the ports of the Levant. Where one established a colony, the other sought to drive it out. Where one won a treaty, the other undermined it. The Mediterranean became their battlefield, not of fields and fortresses, but of harbours and sea lanes. At times their wars resembled duels of states rather than nations. A single battle might decide the fate of markets for decades. In one year, Venetian galleys would burn Genoese warehouses in Constantinople. In another, Genoese corsairs would seize Venetian convoys in the Aegean. The wars were brutal, their scale immense. Thousands of sailors fought aboard fleets of hundreds of ships, their clashes echoing across the waves. For the merchants of both republics, these were not distant conflicts, but struggles for survival. For each war determined whether their goods would reach their markets or sink into the depths. The most famous of these clashes came in the year 1380 at Chioggia, a fishing town within the Venetian lagoon itself. Genoa, having struck blow after blow, brought the war to Venice's doorstep. Its fleet sailed boldly into the lagoon, capturing Chioggia and threatening the very heart of the Republic. Panic spread through the city. For the first time in centuries, Venetians feared that their empire of water might drown in its own lagoon. Yet desperation often breeds genius. Under the leadership of Admiral Carlo Zeno and the indomitable Vetta Pisani, the Venetians rallied. They blockaded the Genoese fleet inside the lagoon, cutting off supplies, hemming their enemy in with chains, stakes, and fireships. Day by day, the Genoese starved their confidence, withering as Venetian resolve grew. At last the tables turned. The once proud invaders, trapped in the very waters they had sought to conquer, surrendered. The victory was total, and with it Venice secured supremacy over its greatest rival. The defeat at Chioggia broke Genoa's spirit. Though it would rise again, it never regained the dominance it once contested so fiercely. Venice emerged scarred but stronger, its people, hardened by the near death of their republic. The victory became legend, proof that even in the darkest hour, the city could summon the will to endure. But these wars were not only fought with swords and sails, they were contests of endurance, of economic might, of who could outlast the other in the long game of commerce. Venice, with its arsenal, its disciplined governance, and its empire of colonies, proved more resilient. Genoa, divided by internal strife and weakened by political faction, could not match the stability of the Lagoon Republic. In the end, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa was more than a struggle for trade. It was a duel of identities of two visions of what it meant to rule the sea. Venice, patient and pragmatic, thrived on systems and endurance. Genoa, bold and opportunistic, burned bright but faltered. Their clash defined an age shaping the destiny of the Mediterranean. And when the waves grew calm at last, it was Venice that remained, its lion still roaring across the waters. The victory over Genoa secured Venice's dominance in the Mediterranean, but it also transformed the Republic in ways less visible, yet more profound. For centuries, Venice had been defined by its lagoon, its arsenal, and its fleets. Now, with rivals beaten back and colonies secured, the city entered an age of prosperity, so dazzling that it seemed to float not only on water, but on gold. This was the age when Venice became known as La Serenissima, the most serene republic. Serenity, however, was not idleness. It was the product of order, wealth, and above all, control. The Venetian government perfected its machinery of councils and committees, ensuring that no single family or faction could seize too much influence. Power was diffused yet concentrated within the patrician class, whose names were inscribed in the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book. To be listed there was to belong to the nobility. To be excluded was to live forever outside the circle of power. In this way, Venice became at once inclusive to its elite and impenetrable to outsiders. The Republic's stability rested on secrecy as much as law. Councils met behind closed doors, decisions were guarded, and even the Doge lived under constant scrutiny. The Council of Ten, a body both feared and respected, acted as the silent guardian of the state. Its informants moved unseen through the streets, listening, watching, collecting whispers of treason. In stone, lions' mouths carved into public walls, citizens could drop anonymous accusations, small slips of paper that might decide a man's fate. It was a society built not on trust, but on suspicion, carefully institutionalized. And yet, for the ordinary Venetian life, in this ordered state, was far from grim. The wealth of empire flowed through the city, filling its markets with spices from the east, wool from England, and glass from Murano that glowed like jewels. On the Rialto Bridge, merchants shouted prices in half a dozen languages. In the Piazza San Marco, nobles paraded in silks, while beggars pleaded for alms beneath the shadow of the basilica's golden domes. It was a city of extremes, yet bound together by the sense that Venice was eternal. Art flourished amid this prosperity. Painters such as Bellini and later Titian filled palaces with colours so vivid that they seemed to capture the light of the lagoon itself. Architects raised new churches, blending Gothic spires with Byzantine domes and Renaissance symmetry. Music echoed through the canals, from sacred choirs to the songs of gondoliers. Venice was a republic of merchants, but it was also a republic of beauty, a place where trade financed art, and art in turn reflected the glory of trade. Even the festivals of the city reflected its dual nature of control and spectacle. The Carnival of Venice, with its masks and disguises, became the one time of year when hierarchy could be inverted, when noble and commoner alike hid behind the same painted visage. In the anonymity of Carnival, Venetians tasted a fleeting freedom, a reminder that beneath the rigid order of the Republic pulsed a desire for release and play. Yet even this chaos was contained, bounded by tradition, and woven into the fabric of the state. Venice's power was not simply economic or military, it was psychological. To visit the city was to be overwhelmed by its grandeur, to walk through streets of water and pass beneath palaces that seemed to float upon the tide. Foreign ambassadors marvelled at the precision of its government, the strength of its fleets, the riches of its markets. They carried home tales that painted Venice as a marvel, a city apart, neither kingdom nor empire, but something unique. This aura of uniqueness was carefully cultivated. Venice told its own story as one of divine destiny, born from refugees protected by St. Mark, wedded to the sea. Its myths were not lies, but instruments of power, reinforcing the belief that the city was eternal, unshakable, chosen. So long as its people believed in that destiny, they would endure. And so long as outsiders believed in it, they would respect or fear the Lion of St. Mark. The most serene republic was serene not because it was free of conflict or corruption, but because it had mastered the art of balance. Balance between suspicion and trust, between order and liberty, between commerce and faith. It was a city that thrived not by chance, but by design, a republic engineered as carefully as the ships of its arsenal, and in that balance lay its greatest strength, the illusion, and perhaps the reality that Venice could last forever. By the 15th century, Venice stood at the very height of its power. Its fleets ruled the Mediterranean, its markets overflowed with wealth, its palaces glittered with marble and mosaics. Foreigners gazed upon it as a miracle, a city suspended between sky and sea, untouchable in its grandeur. Yet beneath the calm surface of La Serenissima, storms were gathering, for no empire, however serene, is immune to the shifting tides of history. The first tremor came from the east. For centuries, Venice had thrived on the weakness of Byzantium, siphoning its trade, exploiting its decline. But in 1453, the ancient empire finally fell. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, was conquered by the Ottomans. The crescent moon rose above the Hagia Sophia, and the world was changed. For Venice, the fall of Byzantium was both opportunity and threat. On one hand, the Republic had already profited from Byzantine weakness, and now it could bargain directly with the new masters of the East. On the other, the Ottomans were not decadent emperors clinging to a fading throne. They were ambitious, disciplined, and determined to control the same trade routes Venice depended upon. War soon followed. Venetian fleets clashed with Ottoman galleys across the Aegean, their battles fierce and costly. Fortresses in Greece and the islands of the Mediterranean fell one by one. Though Venice fought valiantly, it could not match the sheer resources of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Treaties were signed, broken, and signed again, each one ceding more territory. The Lion of St. Mark still roared, but it was beginning to bleed. At the same time, a second storm gathered far beyond the Adriatic, in the waters of the Atlantic. For centuries, Venice had held a near monopoly on the spices of the East, funneled through its colonies, and sold at immense profit across Europe. But then Portuguese explorers, daring the unknown, rounded Africa, and opened a direct sea route to India. What had once flowed inevitably through Venetian warehouses now bypassed them entirely. Spices arrived in Lisbon instead of Venice, and from there spread across the markets of Europe. Slowly, inexorably, the lifeblood of Venetian wealth began to drain away. The Republic did not collapse at once. It adapted as it always had. Venetian merchants sought new trades from grain in the Po Valley to luxury crafts at home. Glass from Murano became prized across Europe. The lace from Burano adorned queens, and the city turned itself into the workshop of beauty. Yet the shift was unmistakable. No longer the undisputed mistress of the seas, Venice was becoming something else, a city of art and culture rather than empire and conquest. Still, the grandeur of Venice in this era was undeniable. The Renaissance blossomed upon its canals. Architects like Sansovino and painters like Bellini and Giorgione transformed the city into a gallery of genius. Music echoed from its churches, philosophy stirred in its academies, and printing presses spread its influence far beyond the lagoon. Even as its political and commercial dominance waned, Venice redefined itself as the jewel of civilization, dazzling not with fleets but with brilliance. Yet the people of the city felt the difference. Where once the arsenal thundered with the ceaseless rhythm of ships built for conquest, now its hammers fell less frequently. Where once Venetian governors ruled distant colonies with iron hands, now the map of empire shrank. A generation that had grown up believing in eternal dominion now whispered fears that the tide was turning. The Lion of St. Mark, still proud, had begun to grow old. But Venice was nothing if not resilient. The Republic had been born from exile, built upon mud, and risen against all odds. If it could no longer rule the seas, it would rule imagination. If it could not command an empire, it would command admiration. And so it turned inward, polishing its palaces, adorning its churches, cultivating an image of magnificence that endured even as its power diminished. In this way, Venice began its long transformation from empire to monument, from mistress of the seas to marvel of the world. The city's strength no longer lay in fleets or colonies, but in the sheer impossibility of its existence, the dreamlike vision of marble and water that would captivate visitors for centuries to come. In the 16th century, Venice's power was no longer unchallenged, yet its splendour dazzled the world more than ever before. Visitors arriving by sea saw the city rise from the horizon, like a mirage domes glistening in sunlight, palaces mirrored in canals, gondolas gliding through waterways as if the city itself floated between heaven and water. To set foot in Venice was to enter a dream, and that dream was carefully constructed. For even as the Republic's empire waned, its image grew only brighter. This was the age when Venice became the theatre of Europe. Its piazzas were stages, its canals backdrops, its festivals performances of power and pleasure alike. The city no longer sought to expand through conquest, but through seduction. Wealth still flowed through its markets, but increasingly it came not from distant colonies, but from the commerce of beauty, art, music, architecture, and the spectacle of Venice itself. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the carnival. Once a local celebration, it blossomed into an institution that drew travellers from across the continent. For weeks each year, the city surrendered to masks and masquerades. Behind porcelain faces and elaborate costumes, nobles mingled with commoners, rich with poor, priests with sinners. Identity dissolved in anonymity, hierarchy melted into play. A gondolier could banter with a count, a courtesan could pass as a lady, a beggar could hide behind silk and feathers. Venice, which in daily life was rigidly ordered and governed by suspicion, now gave itself permission to invert its own rules. Yet the carnival was more than mere indulgence. It was a symbol of the Republic's genius, to control even chaos, to transform potential disorder into ritual. The masks hid faces, but they also revealed truths that everyone, whether noble or servant, carried within them a desire for freedom, for escape, for pleasure. By giving this desire a stage, Venice contained it, channeled it, and in doing so, reinforced its stability. But when the masks came off, life returned to order, and the Republic endured. The same principle applied to Venice's art and architecture. The wealth of the patrician class found expression not in new conquests, but in the construction of beauty. Palaces along the Grand Canal displayed facades that seemed like lace carved in stone. Churches rose with domes painted by masters whose colours caught the light of the lagoon and turned it into living fire. Painters like Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto filled canvases with grandeur, passion, and drama, their works as much declarations of power as objects of devotion. In their art, Venice projected itself not as fading empire, but as eternal muse. Music, too, became part of the city's identity. Choirs sang in San Marco beneath mosaics that shimmered like stars, while composers experimented with polyphony that echoed through the domes in waves of sound. Later, Venice would give birth to opera itself, transforming theatre into music and making performance a commodity that could be sold to visitors and citizens alike. Even pleasure became industry, and industry became spectacle. Foreigners marvelled at this Venice. Diplomats wrote home of a city both decadent and disciplined, a republic that cloaked itself in masks but never lost control. Travellers carried tales of feasts, gondola rides by moonlight, and banquets where music and laughter echoed through halls gilded with gold. For many, Venice was not just a place, but an experience, a living fantasy that blurred the line between reality and performance. But beneath the brilliance lay a quiet truth. The Republic was changing from empire to theatre, from dominion to display. It no longer commanded the spice routes or dictated the politics of the East. Its power was shifting inward toward culture, spectacle, and the creation of myth. Venice became its own greatest invention, a city that ruled not by arms or trade, but by the imagination it inspired in others. Thus, in the 16th century, Venice perfected its transformation. It was no longer the conqueror of Constantinople or the rival of Genoa. It was something rarer, a city that turned survival into art, politics into performance, and decline into splendour. And in this reinvention, it secured for itself a kind of immortality, for while empires fall, beauty endures. By the 17th century, Venice had already begun to shift from empire to monument, yet it remained a place of contradictions. It was no longer the unchallenged mistress of the seas for the Ottomans in the east, and the Spanish and Portuguese in the west had redrawn the map of power. But even as its dominion shrank, its reputation as a city of wonder only grew. The world now looked to Venice, not for fleets and colonies, but for beauty, mystery, and spectacle. And in this age, beauty itself became the Republic's weapon. The palaces along the Grand Canal gleamed brighter than ever. Families whose fortunes no longer came from distant colonies poured their wealth into facades of marble and interiors of fresco and gold. To walk along the canal was to stroll through a living museum, every bend revealing another masterpiece of stone and water. The Rialto bustled with merchants, but their trade was as much in luxury as in necessity. Murano glass lace, fine silks and perfumes. Venice was less a hub of empire now than a theatre of elegance, and the world willingly bought tickets. This shift found its purest form in music. Venice became the city of sound, a place where innovation echoed through churches and theatres alike. Composers experimented with new harmonies, filling the domes of San Marco with music that seemed to descend from heaven itself. The Republic became the birthplace of public opera, opening theatres where anyone with coin could lose themselves in spectacle. Here, music was not confined to courts or chapels. It belonged to the people, to visitors, to anyone ready to be enchanted. The most dazzling star of this musical age was Antonio Vivaldi, the Red Priest. With his flowing hair and fiery temperament, he transformed the violin into a voice of passion. His compositions captured the rhythms of the lagoon, the storms of the Adriatic, the shifting moods of nature itself. In his hands, Venice found a new way to speak to the world, not with the roar of cannons or the clash of fleets, but with melodies that carried across Europe. Even as the Republic's political power waned, its cultural voice soared. Carnival too reached new heights in this century. Masks of porcelain and velvet filled the streets for weeks on end, disguising identities and unleashing desires. Behind the anonymity of the mask boundaries dissolved noble and beggar, priest and libertine, man and woman, mingled in freedom rare for their age. Foreigners flocked to Venice to taste this intoxication, scandalized and seduced in equal measure. For many, Carnival became Venice itself, a place where reality and illusion, order and chaos, faith and pleasure blurred into one unforgettable experience. Yet for all its splendor, shadows lengthened. The wars against the Ottomans dragged on for decades, bleeding the treasury and exhausting the arsenal. Territories in Greece and the Aegean slipped from Venice's grasp one by one. The once feared fleets that had humbled empires now struggled to keep pace with modern navies. At home, plague struck more than once, leaving thousands dead, and the city draped in mourning cloth. Venice, once invincible, revealed its fragility. But here lay the paradox of the Republic. Even as its material strength ebbed, it seemed to grow more eternal in the imagination. The plagues gave rise to votive churches, magnificent structures like Il Redentore and Santa Maria della Salute, raised as prayers in stone. Defeat in war was hidden behind festivals and serenades. Decline was transmuted into beauty, suffering into art. Where other states withered in obscurity, Venice transformed its losses into the very fabric of its identity. Travellers in this age carried home not tales of conquest but of wonder. They described gondolas gliding by torchlight, music drifting from palaces, masked figures laughing in alleyways, and the strange magic of a city where every surface shimmered with reflection. Venice no longer ruled the sea, but it ruled the imagination, and for many that was power enough. Thus the 17th century defined the Republic's second life. The age of empire was fading, but the age of spectacle had arrived. Venice had reinvented itself once more, not as conqueror, but as enchantress. A city that survived not by force, but by beauty. A city that seemed to whisper to all who entered, "Empires may fall, but dreams endure." By the 18th century, the Empire of Venice was a shadow of its former self. The colonies in the Aegean had dwindled, the spice trade had slipped away to Portugal and Holland, and the Lion of St. Mark no longer roared across the seas. Yet in the city itself, one could be forgiven for thinking otherwise. For never had Venice shone brighter as a spectacle of pleasure, decadence, and illusion. If the Republic could no longer command the Mediterranean, it would command desire. The 18th century was the age of the Grand Tour, when aristocrats from across Europe travelled to complete their education. And no itinerary was complete without Venice. Princes, poets, and philosophers flocked to the lagoon, eager to witness the fabled city where art, music, and freedom mingled in ways unknown elsewhere. They came for paintings and opera, but also for experiences whispered of. In salons and courts, masked intrigues, glittering balls, and the promise of pleasures hidden behind carved doors along narrow canals. Carnival became the beating heart of this new Venice. It no longer lasted days or weeks, but months, stretching nearly half the year in a haze of masquerade. By daylight, visitors admired the palaces and churches, the markets and galleries. By night, they lost themselves in gambling halls, theatres, and secret apartments, where anonymity cloaked every indulgence. The mask, once a temporary disguise, became a way of life. In Venice, one could live multiple selves, slipping from role to role without consequence. This age gave birth to characters as legendary as the city itself. None was more famous than Giacomo Casanova, the adventurer, seducer, and writer, whose life seemed a distillation of Venetian spirit. Casanova navigated the Republic with wit and daring, seducing noble women and actresses, gambling fortunes, escaping prison, and leaving behind memoirs that captured the essence of an era when Venice was both playground and labyrinth. Through him, the city's reputation as a capital of intrigue and passion spread across Europe, both scandalous and irresistible. Music and art flourished in equal measure. Vivaldi's compositions echoed in theatres, while Goldoni's comedies filled the stage with laughter, their characters drawn from the very streets of the city. Painters like Canaletto and Guardi immortalized the lagoon in canvases that captured every ripple of water and every shimmer of light. Their works travelled across Europe, turning Venice itself into a commodity. an image to be bought, displayed, and admired even from afar. Yet behind the glitter, the Republic weakened. Its political system, once a marvel of balance and restraint, calcified into rigidity. The patrician families clung to privilege while shutting out new talent. The arsenal, once the forge of fleets, lay idle more often than not. Trade routes shifted beyond reach, and Venice, while still wealthy, no longer controlled the currents of commerce. The Republic had become a theatre whose stage was glorious, but whose backstage creaked with age. Foreign observers sensed the contradiction. Some called Venice a paradise, a dream of marble and music. Others saw only decadence, a city drunk on pleasure, while ignoring the world's transformations. But both were true. Venice in the 18th century was both wonder and warning, a place where decline was disguised as festival, where weakness was masked by splendor. Still, the people of the lagoon clung to their rituals. The marriage to the sea continued. The Doge, still casting his golden ring into the Adriatic, as if the waves themselves could not sense the ebb of Venetian power. The Lion of St. Mark still guarded the city's gates. Though his roar had grown faint, visitors did not come to measure strength, they came to be enchanted, and Venice gave them enchantment in abundance. Thus, the 18th century sealed the Republic's fate. It was no longer an empire but a spectacle, no longer a dominion but a dream. And though dreams cannot stop armies or empires, they can endure in memory. Venice, even in its twilight, understood this. If it could not rule the world, it would haunt it forever. By the end of the 18th century, the dream of Venice confronted a reality it could no longer ignore. For centuries, the Republic had outlasted rivals by cunning and adaptation, turning weakness into spectacle and loss into beauty. But now storms gathered that no mask, no festival, no fleet could disguise. The age of small republics was ending, and the age of great empires had dawned. Venice, serene as ever in ritual, was about to face its fall. The decline had been long in the making. Trade routes that once fed the Rialto now coursed through Amsterdam and London. The Ottoman wars had drained wealth and strength, leaving only memories of galleys that once ruled the seas. Within the Republic, the ruling elite clung to privilege, unwilling to reform their names, locked in the Golden Book, as if eternity could be written on parchment. The arsenal, once a miracle of industry, grew silent. Venice, so adept at reinvention, seemed at last unable to change. And then came Napoleon. The French Revolution had shaken Europe, toppling monarchs and rewriting the rules of power. When its armies, led by the young Corsican general, swept into northern Italy, Venice found itself cornered. The Republic tried to cling to neutrality, to float above the storm, as it had for centuries. But neutrality was no longer possible in a world of revolution and empire. To Napoleon, Venice was not La Serenissima, but an antiquated relic, rich in treasure, but weak in arms. In 1797, French troops marched toward the lagoon. The Doge and councils, once masters of intrigue, could only debate as the enemy advanced. For the first time in a millennium, Venice trembled not before sea storms or plagues, but before a foreign conqueror. Napoleon issued his ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. The choice was no choice at all. On the 12th of May 1797, the Great Council met for the last time. The hall that had echoed with centuries of decisions fell into silence as the motion was read. Venice would dissolve itself, its 1,000-year-old republic, brought to an end, not by vote of the people, but by decree of necessity. The Doge Ludovico Manin laid aside his cap of office. The bells of San Marco tolled not in celebration but in mourning. La Serenissima was no more. French troops entered the city soon after, their boots striking stones that had never known foreign occupation. The Lion of St. Mark, carved in marble above gates and palaces, still looked fierce, but the roar had become only an echo. Napoleon stripped Venice of treasures, shipping paintings, manuscripts, and relics back to Paris. The bronze horses, stolen once from Constantinople and set proudly above San Marco, were carried away again trophies of conquest. The republic that had married the sea, that had stolen a saint, that had humbled empires, ended in surrender. No heroic last stand, no climactic battle, only resignation. For some, it was a tragedy. For others, an inevitability. The world had changed, and Venice had not. Yet even in defeat, Venice endured in another way. The city itself remained its canals, still winding its domes, still gleaming its palaces, still shimmering in the light of the lagoon. Conquerors might strip treasures and erase governments, but they could not erase the dream. Travellers continued to arrive, poets and painters continued to marvel, and Venice, though no longer a republic, remained eternal in imagination. The fall of 1797 was not the end of Venice, but the end of its role as a power. The most serene republic had lasted longer than most empires in history, surviving plagues, wars, and rivals. Its death was quiet, but its life had been thunderous. And even in silence, it whispered a truth that would outlast Napoleon himself, that beauty can endure longer than power, and dreams longer than empires. After the fall of 1797, Venice ceased to be a republic, but it did not cease to exist. Its palaces still glittered on the Grand Canal, its gondolas still glided beneath bridges, and its piazzas still swelled with life. What had ended was political power, not the city itself. Venice became, in a sense, what it had always threatened to become: a stage upon which others performed a prize to be possessed, a dream to be consumed. Napoleon's victory was brief. After his downfall, Venice was handed over to Austria, folded into the Habsburg Empire, like a jewel set in another's crown. For Venetians, it was a bitter transformation. They had been citizens of a republic that had lasted 1,000 years. Now they were subjects of a foreign monarch. The institutions that had defined their world, the Great Council, the Dogeship, the intricate machinery of committees and councils, were gone, replaced by imperial administrators. Where once decisions were made in the palaces of the lagoon, now they were dictated from Vienna. Yet the Austrians, like the French before them, could not extinguish the essence of Venice. The city was too extraordinary, too improbable, too deeply etched into the imagination of Europe. Instead, it became something new, a destination, a living museum. The Grand Tour, which had once introduced Europe's young aristocrats to Venice's splendour, now expanded to include a rising class of travellers. Poets, painters, and musicians flocked to the lagoon, no longer to witness a republic in action, but to lose themselves in the romance of its decay. For them, Venice was no tragedy, but an inspiration. Lord Byron glided in gondolas by moonlight, composing verses that captured the melancholy of a fallen power wrapped in eternal beauty. Turner painted the lagoon in washes of light and colour, transforming it into visions of dream and memory. Romanticism found in Venice its perfect symbol, a city that was both alive and dead, fragile and eternal ruin, and masterpiece in one. This reinvention was not accidental. Venetians themselves learned to live from the myth of their city. Where once they had traded spices and silks, now they traded beauty and memory. They opened their palaces to foreign visitors, turned their festivals into spectacles for outsiders, and sold the dream of Venice to those who came seeking it. Tourism became the new empire, its colonies not in distant seas, but in the minds of those who returned home, carrying Venice in their imagination. Yet beneath the masks of romance, life went on in its practical rhythms. Venetians still fished, the lagoon still crafted glass in Murano, still raised families in the shadow of San Marco. The city adapted as it always had, finding survival not in conquest but in transformation. Venice had lost its sovereignty, but it had gained a new kind of dominion, the dominion of myth which no empire could strip away. Still, the 19th century was not without struggle. The spirit of independence lingered. When revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, Venice rose once more, declaring itself a republic under the leadership of Daniele Manin. For a brief moment, the Lion of St. Mark roared again, banners flew from palaces, and the people fought for the return of their freedom. But Austrian cannons and hunger crushed the dream, and the city once more fell into imperial hands. The Republic had died in 1797, and no resurrection could bring it back. Even so, the revolt left a mark. It proved that Venetians had not forgotten who they were, that beneath the layers of empire and tourism, there still beat the heart of a people who had once ruled the seas. And though their independence was gone, their identity remained. They were Venetians still bound not to empires or rulers, but to the city itself, the lagoon, the rituals, the dream. Thus, the 19th century sealed Venice's transformation, from republic to possession, from empire to museum, from power to poetry. And yet, for all its changes, the city remained itself impossible, luminous, eternal. Venice no longer belonged to the world of politics, but to the world of imagination, and in that world it was still supreme. In the 19th century, Venice belonged no longer to doges or councils, but to the imagination of the world. The city, draped in the melancholy of lost power, became the muse of poets, painters, and dreamers who came to wander its canals and capture its beauty in words and images. Venice had ceased to be a republic, but in its very fall, it had become immortal. The Grand Tour swelled with visitors. Young aristocrats, artists, and intellectuals crossed the Alps not to see an empire in action, but to marvel at the ruins of one wrapped in splendour. They came not for power but for poetry, to drift in a gondola under the moonlight, to watch the sun sink behind San Giorgio Maggiore, to hear the waters lap against stone palaces. These were the new treasures of Venice, as precious as any spice or jewel once carried by its galleys. Writers found in the lagoon a mirror for their own longings. Lord Byron made Venice his stage, swimming across the Grand Canal at dawn, and whispering of love and freedom beneath its bridges, leaving behind verses steeped in desire and melancholy. Percy Shelley, John Ruskin, Henry James, all wrote of Venice as though it were a dream half remembered, a vision poised between glory and decay. Ruskin in particular mourned what he called the stones of Venice, describing the city not only as a masterpiece of architecture, but as a lesson in the fragility of human ambition. Painters, too, carried Venice across Europe. Turner turned its lagoons into luminous visions, skies aflame with colour waters shimmering like mirrors of eternity. Canaletto and Guardi had earlier captured its palaces with precision. Now artists of the Romantic age transformed it into pure emotion. To paint Venice was to paint longing itself, a city both real and unreal, floating between past and present. Music echoed this transformation. Though Venice no longer led the world in composition, its opera houses remained among the most celebrated. Travellers crowded into theatres to hear arias that seemed to rise from the water itself, the voices of sopranos and tenors mingling with the lapping of the lagoon. The city no longer created empires with fleets, but it still conquered hearts with song. For Venetians themselves, life was both continuity and change. They fished the lagoon blue glass in Murano, wove lace in Burano, and guided gondolas through canals that had carried their ancestors for 1,000 years. But they also lived within a theatre staged for outsiders, their city increasingly dependent on the gaze of travellers. Tourism had become their commerce, beauty, their currency memory, their empire. Yet Venice was not only a playground for foreigners. Beneath the surface, a spirit of resistance simmered. The revolts of 1848 had shown that Venetians still remembered freedom, still dreamed of independence. And though Austrian rule returned, it could not erase the pride of a people who had once ruled the seas. That pride lingered in whispers, in songs, in the stories told by gondoliers who rode through shadows of history. By the end of the century, Venice was no longer a republic, no longer a power, but something more elusive, a symbol. It was at once a monument to lost grandeur and a promise of eternal beauty. It stood as a reminder that empires fall, but art endures, that power fades, but imagination is eternal. Thus, the 19th century gave Venice its second empire, not of colonies or fleets, but of dreams. Its dominion stretched not across the Mediterranean, but across the minds of those who visited and those who longed to. And in that empire, Venice remained sovereign, the queen of longing, the muse of centuries. The 19th century closed with Venice firmly woven into the fabric of Italy. After centuries under foreign crowns, first Austria, then Napoleon, then Austria again, the city was finally absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy in 1866. Yet even as the tricolour flag flew over the lagoon, Venice remained something apart. It was Italian, yes, but it was also Venetian, a place whose very stones seemed to whisper that its destiny was different, its history unique, its identity eternal. The unification of Italy brought change, but not transformation. Factories rose on the mainland, but within the lagoon, the rhythms of life remained, much as they had for centuries. Fishermen cast their nets, gondoliers plied their trade, glassmakers in Murano fired their furnaces. Venice's economy turned increasingly toward tourism, for by now the city had become not merely a destination, but a myth. Railways brought travellers more swiftly than ever before, and steamships carried visitors who longed to see what poets and painters had described for generations. The city that had once ruled empires now ruled imaginations. To arrive in Venice by train, emerging onto the Grand Canal, was to step into another world. The clang of modern industry fell away, replaced by the silence of water streets, the gliding of gondolas, the lapping of waves against marble steps. No horses, no wheels, only reflections and echoes. It was as if Venice had refused the 19th century altogether, choosing instead to remain suspended between past and present. Writers continued to shape its image. Henry James saw in Venice a place where beauty and melancholy intertwined, where every palace was both a jewel and a ruin. John Ruskin's The Stones of Venice became both a lament and a call to preservation, urging the world to protect what remained of the city's glory. Others came to escape, to dream, to lose themselves in the labyrinth of alleys and canals. Venice became the quintessential city of longing, a place that seemed always on the edge of memory, as if it were already a ghost, even while still alive. Art, too, evolved. Painters of the late Romantic and early Impressionist schools found in Venice an endless subject, its light shifting hour by hour, turning stone into flame, water into mirrors of sky. Photography began to capture the lagoon as well, fixing, in black and white, what had once been only fleeting impressions. Every image added to the myth, reinforcing Venice as a city not merely seen but dreamed. But with beauty came fragility. The 19th century also brought the first real recognition that Venice was endangered, not from armies, but from nature and modernity itself. Floods rose higher than before, eroding foundations. Industry on the mainland polluted the lagoon. Tourists poured in greater numbers, their presence both sustaining and straining the delicate fabric of the city. Venice, once defended by its waters, now seemed threatened by them. For Venetians, this era demanded resilience. They had survived plague, conquest, and the fall of their republic. Now they faced the subtler challenge of survival in a world that valued their city as symbol more than as home. Yet they endured, proud of their heritage, proud that while empires rose and fell, Venice still stood shimmering in the lagoon. By the dawn of the 20th century, Venice was no longer a republic, no longer a power, but something more elusive, the world's most beautiful ruin and its most enduring dream. To visit was to walk through history alive, to drift through centuries in a gondola, to stand in a piazza where the weight of 1,000 years pressed down, even as music lifted the air. Venice had become what perhaps it was always destined to be. eternal in imagination, fragile in reality, yet forever alive. The 20th century opened with Venice already transformed from a republic of power into a republic of beauty. Yet beauty alone could not shield it from the storms of modernity. 2 world wars shook Europe, and though Venice was spared the worst of destruction, it could not escape the shadow of violence, poverty, and political upheaval. Still the city endured, as it always had its resilience tested yet again by forces larger than itself. During the First World War, the lagoon became a frontier. The Italian army fought along the Piave River, not far from the city, and Venice found itself exposed to danger in a way it had not known for centuries. Air raids scarred its skies and gondolas gave way to patrol boats. Yet even in wartime, Venice retained its strange duality, at once vulnerable and eternal, threatened yet untouchable. The war ended, and the city still floated its domes and palaces unharmed, as though time itself had spared it once more. The interwar years brought both revival and challenge. Fascism swept across Italy and Venice, like the rest of the nation, bent beneath Mussolini's regime. The dictator staged grand displays in the lagoon parades, meant to project power through a city that was itself powerless. Yet the essence of Venice, its quiet canals and timeless beauty, seemed always to resist such impositions. It belonged not to regimes, but to centuries, not to politics, but to eternity. The Second World War tested the city again. Though spared from heavy bombing, Venice lived in fear of occupation and loss. The Jewish community, which had lived in the ghetto for centuries, suffered under fascist racial laws and Nazi persecution. Their absence left a wound in the fabric of the city, a silence in streets that once pulsed with life. Yet once again, the city itself endured its stones and waters, carrying memories heavier than any army. When peace returned, Venice entered a new era, one defined not by conquest or politics, but by preservation and survival. The 20th century brought with it new threats, not from empires or revolutions, but from industry pollution and the sheer weight of modern tourism. The lagoon that had once protected the city now threatened to consume it. Floods rising higher each year, aqua alta seeping into piazzas and palaces. The waters that had given Venice life now threatened its very foundations. And yet even in this precarious state, Venice reinvented itself once more. It became the stage of international culture, hosting festivals that drew the world to its shores. The Venice Biennale, founded at the end of the 19th century, flourished in the 20th, transforming the city into a global capital of art. Painters, sculptors, and visionaries filled its pavilions with new creations, while film stars arrived each year for the Venice Film Festival, gliding across red carpets as gondolas drifted nearby. Tourism swelled to unprecedented levels. Where once aristocrats had come on the grand tour, now millions arrived by train, by car, by plane, by cruise ship. They crowded the bridges, filled the piazzas, and turned the narrow alleys into rivers of humanity. For Venetians, it was both salvation and curse. The city depended on the wealth of visitors, but it also bent beneath their weight. Venice became not just a home, but a spectacle, its survival entwined with its ability to enchant outsiders. Through it all, the city remained what it had always been, a paradox, a place at once fragile and eternal, vulnerable to tides, yet immortal in imagination. Wars passed, regimes fell, industries rose and declined, but Venice floated on its silhouette unchanged against the horizon. In the 20th century, it ceased to be a republic, ceased to be an empire, and became instead something rarer, a reminder that beauty can resist time, that dreams can outlast politics, and that a city built on water can teach the world what it means to endure. To speak of Venice today is to speak not only of a city but of a vision, a place where history and imagination converge so seamlessly that it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The Republic of Merchants, the mistress of the seas, the queen of festivals, she has long ceased to exist in the political sense. Yet she endures in a way more powerful than any fleet or treaty, as symbol as dream, as eternal presence. Visitors still arrive in numbers unthinkable to her founders, pouring across bridges, disembarking from ships, stepping into a labyrinth that feels both ancient and alive. They wander narrow alleys where laundry flutters between crumbling walls. They stand before mosaics that glitter with the gold of Byzantium. They glide in gondolas where the water reflects both stars and street lamps. Each step, each glance carries the weight of centuries. In Venice, the present is never free of the past. Every stone remembers, every tide repeats. The rituals remain, though their meanings have shifted. The marriage to the sea is still performed each spring, the Doge replaced by civic officials who cast a golden ring into the Adriatic. The words are the same, but now they signify continuity rather than dominion, and memory rather than mastery. The carnival still fills the streets with masks, their anonymity no longer a challenge to hierarchy, but an offering to visitors who come to lose themselves in illusion. The city has learned to preserve its identity by transforming it into performance, keeping its traditions alive by opening them to the world. Yet behind the spectacle lies fragility. The waters that once protected Venice now threaten it. Acqua alta floods the piazzas more often, storms rise higher, the lagoon shifts with the weight of climate change. Engineers labour to raise barriers to hold back the tide, to save what time and water conspire to erase. Venetians live with this tension daily. Their lives are balanced between endurance and surrender. They are heirs not only to beauty, but to the burden of preservation, guardians of a city that belongs as much to the world as to themselves. And still Venice persists. She has survived plague crusades, invasion, betrayal, revolution, and empire. She has endured poverty, flood, and the slow erosion of time. Where others would have crumbled, she reinvented herself. From marshland to republic, from empire to museum, from power to myth. Each transformation a survival, each reinvention a defiance. Venice is not eternal because she is unchanged, but because she is always changing. For those who come, Venice is more than a destination. She is a mirror. Lovers see in her reflections their own passion poets, their melancholy artists, their visions dreamers, their longing. She offers herself to the world, not as a city to be possessed, but as an experience to be lived. Her streets are stories, her canals are memories, her palaces are testaments to the truth that beauty can endure longer than empire. So it is that Venice, though fragile, though threatened, remains eternal. The Republic is gone, the fleets have vanished, the Lion of St. Mark no longer commands the seas. But his shadow still lies across the lagoon, and his spirit still roars in silence. Venice does not need to rule to endure, she needs only to exist. And as long as the tide rises and falls, as long as moonlight glimmers on water, as long as human beings long for beauty, Venice will remain impossible, improbable, and everlasting.